Hello, my name is Duray Long. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University and the director of the Creative Interfaces Research and Design Studio. Today, I am going to be talking about my case study on conducting remote design research on embodied collaborative museum exhibits. This work sort of started many years ago. I was working on a series of museum exhibits that were intended to foster family groups' AI literacy, so helping families better understand AI technologies and how they work. And I was working with my museum partner at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago to develop a series of embodied, so physically interacting with these exhibits, and collaborative, so families collaborating together as a group, exhibits that families could interact with to learn about AI. But we all know what happened shortly after February 2020. COVID came into the picture. And so I really had to shift the direction of this research because we were developing exhibits for museums and we had to shift that to a different context. At the point in time that this happened, I was in the sort of early stages of an iterative design research project. So I had engaged in a lot of ideation of different exhibits, which you can see on this slide. So I had created design sketches. I had also created low fidelity prototypes, and I had conducted a co-design workshop with stakeholders to gather their feedback on exhibit ideas and for them to generate ideas of their own. At the time of February 2020, I was sort of shifting to developing higher fidelity prototypes and testing those out on the museum floor. The advent of the COVID-19 pandemic led me to sort of inadvertently explore this question of how can we conduct iterative design research on embodied collaborative learning interventions when we are unable to conduct in-person user studies. And there were a number of considerations or questions that this invited. Obviously, the first was how to make the study contact-free so it was safe for both the researchers and the participants. The second was how do we collect data if we're not in the same room as our research participants? Perhaps the most challenging question that was unique to this particular study is how to keep the interaction embodied and collaborative. These were two key design considerations that were really central to the designs that I had been exploring and didn't would not have been supported by a Zoom environment. This raised sort of some new questions about how do we conduct remote design research that's not just on Zoom. People couldn't engage with the exhibits tangibly or physically in that setting. And finally, I had the question of how to keep the exhibits fun and playful and not make them a burden to user participants. This was a challenging and stressful time for everybody. And I was also studying informal learning. I wanted families to have fun and enjoy themselves as part of the activity. So these were some key considerations that I was keeping in mind when I was considering how to shift my study from an in-person museum environment to a remote setting. And I talk about this more in the paper, but what I did was I took these initial exhibit ideas that I had, the design sketches and the low fidelity prototypes, which were designed for museum spaces, and I iteratively developed those into activity boxes for families to engage with in the comfort of their homes. So this involved scaling down the exhibits. Part of the process involved selecting exhibits that I thought could be scaled down appropriately. So I'm just showing one example. I had a series of exhibits that I did this with, but I'm showing one example on this slide of an exhibit called Creature Features, which was intended to teach learners about bias in data sets by allowing them to sort of put weight on particular features in a data set, which would then impact the outcome of an algorithm that distinguished between birds and non-birds. So you can see here an image of the sort of museum exhibit, which was very large, collaborative, like you interacted with it with your body. And then the final exhibit or activity that I ended up developing for at-home learning spaces, which is more of a game board-like activity. It utilizes a card deck and an iPad interface to allow learners to engage with the algorithm. So again, more details in the paper, but this is sort of the process I went through to adapt each exhibit idea to an activity box in actuality. And I want to jump now to talking about sort of some of the considerations and inspirations that came up for me for adapting design research to remote contexts. These are sort of considerations that I think can be useful to other researchers based on my experience adapting these embodied collaborative museum exhibits to a remote context. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about these here. These are not intended as like a list of must-dos or like a prescriptive list of things that you have to do, but more as a set of sort of inspirations to allow researchers to think about how to adapt embodied collaborative activities to a new context. The first consideration I want to highlight is to examine the artifact. So considering the affordances of the activity or artifact you have designed or are planning to design and thinking about whether you can scale it down or use smaller, more portable components and easy to use technology. So for example, some of my exhibit ideas lent themselves more easily to translating to like a game board type activity than others, which involved more expensive technology or really centered around the idea of like a large scale installation. So I selected the artifacts that I felt would adapt most easily to this new context. I also returned to early prototypes. So I suggest that designers consider whether they developed low fidelity or paper prototypes of their design and returning to those prototypes as inspiration for a version of the activity that encapsulates the sort of main elements of that activity, but uses low cost material and is easy to transport. The next consideration is to make it easy. So I asked designers to consider, can you find technology with easy to use interfaces and simple setup, or are there aspects of the study that you can have participants complete in advance to sort of simplify and reduce the burden on participants? I spent a lot of time considering what types of data collection technology to use to enable learners and families to easily set this up and collect their own data. My next consideration is to make it portable. So thinking about how you can scale down the size of your designs to make them portable, considering how you package your designs. In my case, I packaged each of these activity boxes in a pizza box and I delivered them to families' doorsteps around the Atlanta area, but others might be able to use the same method and mail a set of boxes to people, for example. So considering the packaging and transport. The next consideration is to prioritize fun, excitement, and mystery. So thinking about how you can make your user study fun. Can you use study methods that do not feel like tests or extensions of the school or workday? And how can the packaging and presentation foster excitement and mystery surrounding the activities? For example, a lot of the families that engaged with these activity boxes reported that finding the boxes on their doorstep and the unboxing activity of opening them up together really provided a lot of anticipation and excitement for them and their kids during a difficult time. The next consideration is, what if we didn't use Zoom? So consider how you might conduct your study without or with minimal use of video conferencing. In my case, I was really concerned with how to make this a fun activity. Families and kids had already been spending like 8 hours a day on Zoom with work and school during COVID. And so I gave participants the option of participating in a video call or just engaging together with their family and recording their data on their own. So thinking about how you can provide such options is important in this process. The next consideration is redundancy, redundancy, redundancy. So thinking about how you can introduce redundancy in your data collection process without overburdening participants. So for example, I collected video data, audio data, as well as had participants complete a survey after their interaction in order to ensure that I gathered some data even if one of the data collection technologies malfunctioned due to user error. The next consideration was parallel play, so thinking about making multiple copies of your design so you can conduct several studies in parallel, and thinking about how long it will take for participants to complete your study and how long delivery and pickup will take, because this method of conducting design research takes longer than just conducting one study in a museum space. The next consideration is to diversify recruitment methods. This is something that's important, beyond this context, but it was particularly challenging to recruit participants to engage in a user study during the pandemic. So thinking about who is using the audience on the platforms you're recruiting on and what reach your recruitment methods have is really important. And we iterated on this throughout our study to reach a broader audience that was more representative of the metro area where we were conducting the study. And finally, the last consideration to end on a positive note is to find a silver lining. So, thinking about what some of the possible positive outcomes of scaling down your designs or making your study remote are, and what lessons you can translate to your research more broadly. In my case, I was able to create a set of low cost, portable activities, which you can access with this QR code here, to teach family groups about AI that extends beyond the museum and allows a larger group of people to engage with these AI literacy learning activities than I would have been able to do in a museum. Of course, in the past few years, we have been lucky to return to a lot of in-person studies due to vaccines, but this has implications for a lot of research sort of beyond the pandemic. It has research for interacting with at-risk populations during the pandemic, as it is still ongoing. It has implications for design research with communities who may not be able to easily visit the study location, such as physically distant communities, disabled communities, or people without the ability to take time off work to visit a site location. And this also has implications for future local or global crises and the possibility of reducing carbon emissions in research. Thank you so much to everyone who has supported this work over the years, and I would be happy to take any questions. My contact information is on this slide.